Hey friends, I'm the storyteller. Before you get too comfortable, do me a small favor, hit like and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy this kind of storytelling. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories reach. Albert Fish is a name that has haunted true crime history for decades. He's known by many disturbing nicknames: the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Boogeyman, the Brooklyn Vampire, even the Gray Man. His story has been told over and over again across documentaries, films, books, and dark folklore. But his real name, the one he was born with, wasn't even Albert Fish. He was born Hamilton Howard Fish. Hamilton came into the world on May 19th, 1870. He was a Taurus, born in Washington, D.C., and he was the youngest of 4 surviving children. But he wasn't the only child his parents ever had. Some of his siblings had already passed away before he was born. His father, Randall Fish, and his mother, Ellen Fish, had a truly staggering age gap, something almost unheard of even today. There was a 43-year difference between them. Randall was 75 years old when Hamilton was born. 75. This wasn't a family built on stability. Mental illness ran deep in their bloodline. One of his uncles suffered from mania, and one of his sisters was diagnosed with what was called a mental affliction, though that term doesn't really exist anymore and could mean 100 different things. One of his brothers would later be institutionalized. His mother, Ellen, was known to suffer from hallucinations, and at least 3 other family members had been diagnosed with some kind of psychiatric disorder. There was a cloud over this family long before Hamilton was old enough to understand what it meant, and when he was just 5 years old, that cloud grew darker. His father passed away aged 80 from a heart attack. His mother, now a widow, was left with 4 children and no means to support them. She simply couldn't work and care for them all at once. She made the heartbreaking decision to send them into an orphanage. For Hamilton soon to become Albert, life at the orphanage was far from safe. He was relentlessly teased by the other children. They called him names. The worst and most persistent was Ham and Eggs. It's unclear why, perhaps a mocking play on his given name, Hamilton, but it stuck, and he hated it. He wanted to be someone else, to shake off the cruelty, to become someone new. So he chose the name Alberta, name taken from one of his older siblings who had died before he was born. It was a tribute to the brother he never got to meet, a way to reclaim his identity. He told the other boys, "Call me Albert," and from then on, that was the name he carried with him for the rest of his life. But the emotional torment was only one part of his suffering. The abuse at the orphanage wasn't limited to teasing. There was also physical abuse, and not just from the children, but from the adults as well. The staff, the people who were supposed to care for them, because this was the late 1800s. And back then, whipping children, beating them, using violence as discipline was considered completely normal. As Albert entered the early stages of puberty, the years of abuse he'd endured began to twist into something far more disturbing. The regular beatings he received at the orphanage, whether from staff or other boys, had once been sources of fear and pain. But now, something inside him was changing. He started to notice that during these beatings he would feel something else: pleasure. He began to experience sexual arousal when he was whipped or struck. And once the others around him caught on, things only got worse. The older boys, already cruel, began to target him even more. They hurled homophobic slurs at him. They mocked him, humiliated him, ridiculed the very reactions he couldn't control. And the more they beat him for it, the more he internalized not only the shame but the desire. It was in that orphanage, under the weight of pain and isolation, that Albert Fish's hatred for humanity took root. It became the birthplace of his twisted world view, one in which revenge and suffering were not just tools, but pleasures. He began to fantasize about inflicting pain the same way it had been inflicted on him. It wasn't just about retaliation. It was about control, about power, about recreating the violence that had shaped him, but with himself as the one in charge. Eventually, when Albert was 9 years old, his mother Ellen managed to find work. She regained some financial stability, and with that came the ability to remove her children from the orphanage. Albert returned home, but things were far from normal. At home, he struggled deeply. He was a frequent bedwetter, which especially in those times was considered shameful and was often punished. He also had a habit of disappearing from the house, wandering off, No clear explanations, no reasons given. Perhaps he was trying to escape something. Or perhaps, even then, he was beginning to seek out what he had learned to crave. The truth is, details of what went on inside his household during this time are limited. But given the era and the expectations of discipline, it's not a stretch to assume that physical punishment likely continued at home. It was a different time when beating a child wasn't considered abuse, but correction. And Albert? He had already begun seeking other outlets for the disturbing desires growing inside him. He started frequenting public swimming pools, not to swim, but to wait, to linger around the changing rooms. He would watch young boys undress, standing silently, observing. And according to some reports, he would even masturbate while watching them. When Albert was just 12 years old, he entered into his first romantic and sexual relationship with another boy, also 12. But this was far from the innocent exploration of childhood. The boy he became involved with introduced Albert to a world of deeply disturbing behaviors. Together, they experimented with bodily fluids. They drank urine and reportedly consumed feces. It was a relationship that shaped Albert's view of intimacy in the most grotesque, unnatural way. By the time he was 15, Albert suffered a serious accident. While playing with some neighborhood boys, he fell from a tree and hit his head hard. He was diagnosed with a concussion and left with a series of long-term effects, frequent headaches, dizzy spells, and most noticeably, a persistent stutter that stayed with him for life. At 20 years old, in the year 1890, Albert and his mother moved to New York City. He was the last child, still living at home, the youngest of the family, and so it was just the two of them now. But once in the city, Albert's life took a very dark turn. He began working as a male prostitute, and at the same time, began molesting young boys. His preference was especially horrifying. He targeted boys under the age of 6, and as his urges deepened, Albert looked for more outlets. He began scouring the personal ad sections in the newspapers, those little classified squares where people could pay to post short messages. Sometimes they were seeking a job, sometimes selling a used couch, sometimes just looking for companionship. Albert wasn't interested in the couch listings. He would write letters in response to ads, posted by women, letters filled with obscene, graphic, and deeply disturbing sexual content. He never knew if they'd reply. That wasn't the point. The writing itself became part of the ritual. By the time he was 28, Albert took a job as a handyman doing odd jobs, fixing things, working quietly in other people's homes. Around this time, his mother arranged a marriage for him to a girl named Anna Mary Hoffman. She was only 19 years old, almost 10 years his junior. The couple would go on to have 6 children together. But domestic life didn't tame Albert. Even during his marriage, he engaged in multiple affairs with men, and he wasn't particularly secretive about it. He would go on public dates with other men, seemingly without concern for judgment or consequence. And it was during one of these dates that everything shifted again. One of his lovers took him to a waxwork museum place filled with realistic sculptures of anatomical curiosities. One exhibit in particular caught Albert's attention, a dissected penis. For some reason, that exhibit stuck with him. It awakened something new inside him, not just a desire to be hurt, but a desire to dismember. A fascination with cutting, dissecting, and particularly with castration. From that moment on, his fantasies grew darker. Albert began inserting needles into his own groin during moments of sexual arousal. Sometimes he would push them so deep that they disappeared, vanished inside his body. Needles he could no longer remove. Needles he would simply leave there. Years later, during a medical examination and X-ray imaging, doctors discovered something that stunned them. There were 29 full sewing needles embedded in Albert Fish's pelvic region. They had been there for years, just embedded in there forever. In 1903, at the age of 33, Albert Fish was arrested and jailed for embezzlement. Even behind bars, he didn't change. If anything, his behavior escalated. While serving his sentence, he continued having affairs with men, something that, by this point, had become a regular part of his life. It's unclear whether his wife knew the full extent of it, but based on how openly he acted, it's entirely possible that she knew and simply chose not to care. But when Albert was finally released, his children noticed something different. Their father was no longer just strange, he was unraveling. He began hearing voices claim they were from God. from the apostles. These voices, he said, were giving him divine instruction. They were telling him he was the second coming of Christ and that his mission on earth was to castrate young boys. He began engaging in ritualistic self-harm as a way to atone for his sins. The clinical term for this kind of behavior is religious mania, and around this time, he was actually diagnosed with it by multiple psychiatrists. Albert created a homemade Wapona crude, painful tool that he used on himself. It was something like a bat or paddle, but with 4-inch nails hammered through it. And he would beat himself with it again and again. He called it penance. Others would call it madness. In 1910, now 40 years old, Albert Fish met a young man named Thomas Kedden. Thomas was just 19 years old, and he had an intellectual disability that made him vulnerable. Albert noticed this immediately. That's precisely why he targeted him. Thomas was easy to manipulate, easy to control. Albert lured him away from the city to an abandoned farmhouse, where he locked him inside for 2 weeks. During that time, Albert subjected Thomas to unimaginable abuse. He was used as a sex slave, beaten, tortured, and controlled. Albert later admitted that his plan had originally been to kill Thomas when he was finished with him, but then he realized it was summer. The heat would cause the body to decompose quickly, and the smell could attract attention. That risk changed his mind. So instead, Albert did something else. He took a pair of scissors and severed Thomas Kedden's penis, keeping it as a souvenir. Later, Albert would say that he would never forget the sound, the screams that Thomas made in that moment. They echoed in his mind for years, but he didn't kill him. Instead, Albert bandaged the wound, cleaned him up as best he could, handed him $10, and then did something even more chilling. He kissed him goodbye and sent him on his way. That's the last we know of Thomas Kedden. It's believed that he survived and lived out the rest of his life, but there's no record of him going to police her. If he did, it never led back to Albert Fish. The attack went unpunished. Shortly after this, Albert's personal life crumbled. His wife left him. She didn't know about Thomas Kedden, or at least no one believed she did, but one day, while Albert was at work, she simply packed up her things and left with another man. When Albert returned home, he found that half the belongings were gone, and she had abandoned him with all 6 of their children. Now Albert was alone with his kids, and that's when things got worse. His children later described how his behavior turned deeply bizarre. One day, they walked into a room and found their father wrapped up tightly in a carpet, lying on the floor. When they asked him why, he calmly explained that one of the apostles told him to do it. He began claiming that the voices in his head were commanding him to eat human flesh. And while he didn't act on that just yet, he began to experiment by eating raw animal meat at first. He even tried to feed it to his children, forcing them to eat it during meals. They later recalled that these episodes were especially common during the full moon. And it was because of these strange behaviors, the full moon rituals, the obsession with raw flesh, and the hallucinations that he eventually earned one of his most haunting nicknames, the Werewolf of Wisteria. Although Albert Fish never directly abused his children, at least not in the way people might assume, he did involve them in his disturbing fantasies, and that might be even more horrifying in its own way. He made it seem like a game. He would get down on all fours in the middle of the room and ask one of his children to climb onto his back. Then he'd say something like, "Hold up any number of fingers behind my head and I'll try to guess how many." If he guessed wrong, the child would be allowed to hit him with his homemade nail-spiked paddle, the same one he used to beat himself with during his religious rituals. To them, it was just a strange game. To Albert, it was sexual gratification disguised as harmless fun. But of course, that wasn't enough for him. It never was. Albert still frequented brothels, where he would pay sex workers not for sex, but for pain. He wanted them to beat him, to whip him, to humiliate him. And often, he didn't engage in intercourse at all. He was there for the punishment. As his urges grew stronger, so did his self-harm. He began taking cotton wool, soaked in lighter fluid, shoving it into his anus, and setting it on fire. This wasn't done in a frenzy or by accident. It was deliberate, controlled, repeated. And it was around this time, 1919, that Albert Fish's pattern of attacks truly began. Thomas Kedden had been the last person he had tortured up to that point, but now it was like something snapped inside of him. The urges were no longer sporadic, they were constant, relentless. He began going out at night, roaming the streets, targeting victims that he believed no one would miss. Specifically, he looked for disabled men and African American men individuals who, in his twisted logic, were less likely to be noticed if they suddenly disappeared. He later said that he believed the police wouldn't care as much about victims from these groups, that if he attacked them, if he even killed them, the system wouldn't try very hard to catch him. He felt invincible. And horrifyingly, he was right. Albert Fish would go on to stab and assault multiple men during this time, slipping back into the shadows after each attack. The brutality was often random, suddenly, cruel. He left trails of blood and broken bodies, but no one connected them back to him. And he did get away with every single one of those attacks. In 1924, when Albert Fish was 54 years old, he was walking along a quiet country road, not far from farmland, when he noticed a young girl playing alone in one of the open fields. Her name was Beatrice Keel. She was just 8 years old. She was out by herself, but still on her family's property. Her parents owned the farmhouse nearby, and she had likely wandered a little too far from the front porch, close enough to the house to feel safe, but far enough to be vulnerable. Albert Fish approached her. He asked if she would help him pick some rhubarb. Beatrice was hesitant. This was a strange man, and something about him made her uneasy. But then he pulled out money, a few coins, saying offered it to her as payment for her help. That changed her mind. She agreed to help, and the two of them began walking away from the property. But just as they were disappearing down the road, Beatrice's mother stepped out of the house. She immediately saw her daughter walking off with a man she didn't recognize. Alarm bells rang in her head, and she ran after them. She grabbed Beatrice's arm and demanded to know who the man was. Albert tried to explain, but she wasn't having it. She shouted at him, ordered him off the property, made it clear he wasn't welcome. Albert left, but he wasn't done. That same night, he returned to the Keel family property and hid inside their barn, waiting, watching, maybe hoping for another opportunity. But something tipped the family off, maybe a sound, maybe a feeling, and this time, Beatrice's father found him. He chased Albert off the property once again, and this time, he didn't come back. Still, the urge inside him was boiling. Not long after the Keel incident, Albert turned his attention to two young boys. He had what he called his implements of hell, 3 tools he carried with him, tools he intended to use for torture, mutilation, and ultimately murder. These implements were a meat cleaver, a butcher's knife, and a small handsaw. He carried them with purpose. They weren't tools, they were ritual objects, and now he was ready to use them. Earlier in the year, Albert had been grooming a young boy named Cyril Quinn. He had been molesting Cyril for some time, slowly gaining his trust. And one day, Albert invited Cyril and a friend over to his apartment for lunch. It didn't seem out of the ordinary. Cyril was used to the manipulation by now, so the boys agreed. When they arrived, Albert told them he would prepare some sandwiches in the kitchen, and they could wait in his bedroom, play around, and relax. It was all part of the routine, keep them comfortable, keep them unsuspecting. But then, something unexpected happened. As the boys were play wrestling on the bed, they knocked the mattress halfway off the frame, and when they did, it revealed what was hidden beneath the bed. The implements of hell. All 3 of them, the cleaver, the knife, the saw. The boys froze. For a split second, they didn't understand what they were looking at. And then, they did. Without a word, they both bolted out of the apartment. No explanation, no goodbye. Just pure survival instinct. And Albert, frustrated, but undeterred, watched them flee. But if they thought they had stopped him, they were wrong. Because Albert wasn't prepared to just give up there. And he struck again just 4 days later, on the 14th of July, 1924. On the 14th of July, 1924, 8-year-old Francis McDonald was reported missing by his parents. He'd spent the afternoon playing outside with his friends, just like any other day, but when the sun started to go down and he didn't come home, his parents began to worry. As the minutes stretched into hours, panic set in. They knew their son. He was never late. He never just wandered off. So police were called, and the first step was obvious. Talk to the children he'd been playing with. They were the last people to see him. One by one, the officers interviewed the boys, and their story was the same. Francis had left the group with an older, gray-haired man. With that disturbing piece of information, investigators began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, asking anyone if they'd seen something any out of the ordinary that afternoon. One neighbor said they had seen a young boy walking into the woods with a gray-haired man. That tip matched the children's story exactly. Another neighbor, Francis's own mother, came forward with a chilling detail. She believed she too had seen that very same man walking into the woods earlier that day. Frantic and desperate, she gave a statement to the press. Her plea was raw, public, and emotional. She asked for help finding the man who had taken her songe. She begged people to come forward with any information about the gray man. That one phrase, the gray man, was printed in papers, repeated on radios, passed along by word of mouth. And it would become one of Albert Fish's most infamous nicknames. But before the search could lead to anything hopeful, Francis's body was found. A group of Boy Scouts, hiking through the local woods, made the discovery. What they found was horrific. Francis had been brutally sexually assaulted and then strangled with his own suspenders. The strangulation was so forceful that the suspenders had nearly embedded into his neck. The pressure had driven the fabric into his skin, slicing through layers like a blade. But that wasn't all. Francis had been tortured. He had multiple cuts across his body. Some of them appeared to have been deliberately placed, as if meant to prolong suffering. His buttocks had been partially skinned. The scene was one of unimaginable cruelty. Years later, Albert Fish would admit that his plan had been to castrate Francis, just like he had done to Thomas Kedden. But before he could follow through with it, he heard voices and movement elsewhere in the woods. He panicked. He decided to kill the boy quickly and flee, abandoning whatever twisted ritual he had planned. The murder sent shockwaves through Staten Island. This wasn't just another crime. This was one of the most horrifying cases in the island's history. Newspapers covered it extensively. People were terrified. Parents kept their children indoors. This kind of violence, this proportion of sadisms, was unthinkable. It became one of the biggest investigations Staten Island had ever seen. And for Francis's father, it was even more personal. He was a police officer, though, working in a different department at the time. But after the murder, he requested a transfer to the team investigating his own son's death. He wanted to be directly involved in catching whoever had done this to his little boy. When the autopsy was performed, doctors noted a detail that stood out. Francis had been eating raisins shortly before he died. His friends said they hadn't had any raisins that day, so police theorized that his abductor may have lured him with them, using the threat to gain his trust. But there was something else. The pathologist said something that clouded the entire investigation. The medical examiner didn't believe an elderly man could have committed such a physically violent act. He said the injuries required too much strength for a frail, aging body, and yet every witness had described the man who took Francis as gray-haired, as old. That single doubt derailed the investigation. Dozens of men were arrested, interrogated, some even charged with Francis McDonald's murder. But one by one, they were let go. There just wasn't enough evidence. And the real killer, Albert Fish, he wasn't even on their radar. Albert Fish, the real murderer, wasn't even so much as suspected. His name never even came up. In February 1927, 3 years after his last known murder, Albert Fish struck again. This time, the victim was a 4-year-old boy named Billy Gaffney. Billy lived in an apartment building in Brooklyn, and on the day he disappeared, he had been playing in the hallway with 2 other children, his 3-year-old friend, who was also named Billy, and an 11-year-old boy, the older brother of the younger Billy. At one point, the older boy left the 2 toddlers alone for just a few minutes. He stepped inside the apartment to grab something. When he returned, only the 3-year-old was there. The older Billy Gaffney was gone. Panic set in immediately. The older boy ran to get the parents, and the adults began frantically searching the building. They asked the 3-year-old what had happened. Had he seen anything? His answer was simple and chilling. The boogeyman took him. And that is where Albert Fish earned another of his infamous nicknames, the boogeyman. Despite a massive search effort, Billy Gaffney's body was never recovered. There were no remains, no bloodstains, no physical evidence. And that's because Albert Fish later admitted that he had done something unimaginable. He told police that he had taken Billy, sexually assaulted him, and mutilated his body beyond recognition. He described holding the boy captive and torturing him for an extended period. Fish didn't just kill Billy, he broke him down slowly. I won't describe the torture, I won't describe what he did, but it's important to understand that he did it to all of his victims. Always. When it was finally over, Albert Fish brought the boy's body home with him. He drained the blood, he drank it. Then he chopped up the remains, cooked them, and ate the flesh often with vegetables, as if it were a Sunday meal. He believed that consuming his victims allowed him to absorb them. It wasn't just murder, it was ritual. 1 year after Billy Gaffney's murder, Fish was ready to act again. On May 28, 1928, he came across a small classified ad in a local newspaper. It had been placed by a teenager named Edward Budd. Edward was in his late teens, and he was desperately looking for work. The ad was brief, straight to the point. Edward said he was willing to do any kind of labor or anything to help support his struggling family. Albert saw opportunity. He wasn't looking for an employee. He was looking for a victim. And Edward sounded perfect. So Fish began to craft his trap. He decided to approach the Budd family as an old man, looking for help, harmless, lonely, physically weak. Someone who needed a young man to come help out around his home. He was 58 years old at the time, and his age worked in his favor. People didn't see him as a threat. His frail appearance made him look more like a grandfather than a predator. So he wrote to the Budd family and sent them a telegram. In it, he introduced himself and offered Edward a job. "I'm interested," he wrote. "I want your son to come work for me. I'm an old man. I can't do my housework by myself anymore. I need some help around the house." Not long after responding to the classified ad, Albert Fish went to visit the Budd family in person, but he didn't arrive as Albert Fish. He introduced himself as a man named Frank Howard, soft-spoken, elderly gentleman who claimed to own a small farm out in the country. He was charming, polite. He spoke directly to Edward, the teenage boy who had placed the ad. He asked him about his experience with manual labor and told him he could use a strong young man to help out on his property. Edward was excited. This would be his first real job, and it meant a few days away from the city, living on a quiet farm, earning money for his family. What he didn't know, what no one knew, was that Albert Fish had no farm, no job, and no good intentions. His plan was simple. Take Edward to his home, tie him up, mutilate him, and leave him to bleed to death. But all of that changed when Albert arrived at the Budd residence. The door opened, and standing there in front of him was Grace Budd, Edward's 10-year-old sister. And in that moment, Albert's plan shifted completely. He no longer wanted Edward, he wanted Grace. Something about the sight of her innocent, quiet, curious, his mind spiraling in a different direction. He had to think fast. He couldn't just leave empty-handed. He needed to create a new plan. So he sat down with the family. They all had tea together, Albert, or rather Frank Howard, and the Budds. He was calm, composed, the picture of trustworthiness. Then he casually mentioned that he wouldn't be able to take Edward with him that day after all. He said he just remembered that his niece's birthday party was that afternoon. His 10-year-old niece. No lesson, he simply couldn't miss it. But he reassured them. He would come back for Edward in just a few days. As he stood up to leave, he paused. He turned to the family and said something that would change everything. "Would Grace like to come with me to the party?" He explained that there would be lots of girls, Grace's age, games, food. It might be fun for her. A chance to get out of the house. Grace's eyes lit up. She begged her parents to let her go. She wanted to see the countryside. She wanted to be part of something exciting. Her parents hesitated. They didn't really know this man. They weren't sure about sending their daughter off with a stranger. But Albert seemed so kind, so old, so safe. After a brief discussion, Grace's father gave in. "Let her go," he said. "What's the harm?" And with that, Grace left with Albert Fish. Before leaving the Budd household that day, Albert Fish, still going by the name Frank Howard, promised that he would have Grace back by 9 p.m. He also said he would pick Edward up at the same time and take him away to begin work on his farm. But when 9 p.m. came, there was no sign of Grace. No knock on the door, no return. At first, The Budd family tried to rationalize it. Maybe the party had run a little late. Maybe they lost track of time. Maybe Frank Howard had decided to bring her straight home in the morning. They tried to stay calm. They told themselves they'd see her at breakfast. But morning came, and still no Grace. Her mother began to panic. Her father, silent and stunned, knew something was wrong. They had been too trusting. And now, their daughter was gone. They rushed to the nearest police station and reported her missing. Investigators began their search by looking into Frank Howard, but it didn't take long to realize that no such man existed. The name was fake. It had never existed in any public registry. Back then, it was incredibly easy to disappear behind a false identity. There were no centralized databases, no fingerprints, no way to trace someone who didn't want to be found. Still, the Budd family had gotten a good look at the man. They provided a detailed description: his gray hair, his quiet voice, his kind smile. Police circulated wanted posters with Grace's photo and a sketch of the man known only as Frank Howard. They were plastered across New York, but weeks passed. Then months, nothing. The only lead came from a telegram office in East Harlem, where the original message from Frank Howard had been sent. But that alone didn't give them much. It only narrowed the location slightly. Eventually, a completely innocent man was arrested, charged, and even sentenced for Grace Budd's murder. He served 108 days in jail over 3 months before it came to light that he had nothing to do with the crime. His wife had accused him out of spite during a messy split, and in a rush for justice, the police had believed her. After that, the case went cold. For 6 whole years, there were no answers. No new leads, no sign of Grace. Her parents tried to carry on, but hope was fading. Deep down, they feared they would never know what had happened to their little girl. And then a letter arrived. It was from Albert Fish himself. He had written to the Budd family personally. The letter was long, rambling, and horrific, a twisted confession of everything he had done. You can still find it online today, word for word, but it's not something anyone should read lightly. Here's what the letter revealed. He told them he had taken Grace to an abandoned farmhouse. It was a location he had scouted out beforehand, originally planning to take Edward there. But when he saw Grace, his plan shifted. At the farmhouse, he instructed Grace to wait outside, claiming he needed to prepare something inside. He went upstairs. He removed all of his clothes not to avoid suspicion, but because he didn't want to get blood on them. Then he watched her from a window. She was outside, picking wildflowers, completely unaware. He called out to her, "Come upstairs." She did. She entered the room, and Albert Fish leapt out from a wardrobe, completely naked. The moment she saw him, she screamed. She cried, said she would tell her mother. She tried to run, but it was already too late. He attacked her, overpowered her, and pinned her down. She fought back as best as a 10-year-old could, kicking, scratching, biting, but he was stronger. He strangled her, and she died. In the letter, Albert then described calmly, without remorse, how he decapitated Grace's body, chopped it into pieces, and brought it home. There, over the next 9 days, he cooked it. He seasoned it, and he ate it. After receiving the letter about Grace Budd, police took it straight to forensics. There was something about the handwriting, meticulous, shaky, old-fashioned, that they recognized. They compared it with the original telegram that had been sent to the Budd family years earlier, back when a man named Frank Howard had first introduced himself. And sure enough, it was the same handwriting. That didn't tell them exactly who wrote it, but it confirmed something chilling. This letter was real. It wasn't a hoax. It wasn't someone playing games. The person who wrote this letter had also sent that original telegram. The person who lured Grace Budd away was the same man who had just described, in horrifying detail, what he had done to her. It was their first real lead in years, but the letter itself disturbing, as it was offered no return address, nothing that directly pointed to a name or location, until one of the detectives looked at the envelope. Printed in small letters along the corner of the envelope was a company name, NYPCBA, New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. It seemed minor, but it was a thread, and police were ready to pull it. They paid a visit to the NYPCBA offices, hoping someone might remember who had access to those envelopes, and they got lucky. A janitor working there told them that a few weeks earlier, right around the time the letter was believed to have been written, he had taken home a handful of those envelopes for personal use. But there was something else. The janitor said he had moved house right around that same time, and in the chaos of packing, he had left a few of those NYPCBA envelopes behind in his old apartment. That's where things clicked. The officers asked, "Who's living in your old unit now?" The janitor said he wasn't sure, so they went directly to the landlady of the building. They asked her, "Who's staying in the janitor's old room now?" Her response? A man named Albert Fish. At first, that name didn't mean anything to the police. They were still looking for someone named Frank Howard. But then they asked for a description of this Albert Fish. They told her what the Budd family had said: an elderly man, gray-haired, polite but strange. And the landlady said, yes, that's him. It was the first time Albert Fish's real name was connected to the Grace Budd case. The police set up outside his building, prepared to wait until he came home. But that night, he didn't come back. They returned the next day, and the next, and the next after that. But still, Albert Fish just wasn't coming home. Realizing that Albert Fish was now actively avoiding his apartment, the police decided to switch tactics. They put his building under surveillance. A patrol car was parked outside the property around the clock, officers watching for any sign of the old man returning. But they didn't go inside. They didn't want to spook him any further. They just waited. And they waited. And waited. For over a month, the police sat outside that building. But Albert Fish never showed up. It was clear. He knew. He knew the police were closing in. Eventually, the department decided it was a waste of resources. They called off the surveillance. There was no point in watching an empty apartment forever. Instead, they turned to the landlady and said, "If he returns, call us immediately. Keep him there. Stall him. Do whatever you need to do. Just don't let him leave." And so the apartment fell quiet again. 4 months went by. And then, one day, the phone rang. It was the landlady. Albert Fish had returned. He just walked back into the building like nothing had happened. The landlady stayed calm. She offered him a drink, invited him to sit and rest. She made small talk while secretly contacting police. Every minute counted. She needed to keep him distracted. And then, after what felt like an eternity, a detective burst through the door. There, sitting in the chair, sipping his drink, was a fragile old man with hollow eyes and sunken cheeks. His frame was withered, his presence ghost-like. The detective asked, "Are you Albert Fish?" And in that moment, Fish tensed up. He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out a blade, holding it up like a makeshift shield. But he was too old, too weak. The detective lunged forward and disarmed him almost immediately. There was no fight. Fish slumped back into the chair like a man who knew it was over. He was arrested on the spot, charged with the murder of Grace Budd, and escorted to the police station. And there, without hesitation, Albert Fish confessed. He admitted everything. He spoke in detail about Grace's murder, describing the farmhouse, the way he lured her upstairs, and what he did to her afterward. He knew that confession alone would guarantee him the death penalty. But rather than try to save himself, he doubled down. He wanted to be infamous. He confessed to killing Francis McDonald. He confessed to murdering Billy Gaffney, to drinking their blood, to cooking their flesh, and eating them over the course of several days. But he didn't stop there. Fish also claimed that he had committed hundreds of attacks, including assaults, rapes, and mutilations crimes that no one had ever connected to him. And finally, in one of the most disturbing claims of all, he looked at the officers and said, "I had a child in every state," meaning, by his own admission, Albert Fish believed he had killed at least 50 more children. In the aftermath of his arrest, police worked tirelessly to connect Albert Fish with other missing children cases across the country. They believed he'd done many more. But despite the confessions, the vague claims, and the horrifying details he offered, they just couldn't find the evidence to definitively link him to additional victims. So, officially, Albert Fish was only ever charged with 3 murders: Grace Budd, Francis McDonald, and Billy Gaffney. But behind closed doors, investigators suspected the number was much, much higher, possibly up to 100. When his trial began, Albert Fish was the image of stillness. He sat motionless in the courtroom, silent, his face unreadable. He wasn't smiling, he wasn't crying, he wasn't trying to win sympathy. He wasn't basking in attention like some killers do. He just didn't care. He didn't flinch, didn't speak unless spoken to, didn't seem to feel anything. Even during his time in custody between his arrest and trial, he continued to self-harm. On nights when chicken was served in the prison cafeteria, Fish would smuggle one of the bones back to his cell. He would sharpen it, methodically grinding it down to a point. Then, when no one was looking, he would use it to stab himself repeatedly. Some believed it was a suicide attempt. Others said it was simply part of his compulsive self-punishment, another chapter in his long, twisted history of masochism. But given everything we know about him, it's likely this was just another way for Albert Fish to hurt himself, because pain had always been a part of who he was. His trial lasted 10 days. Albert Fish pled not guilty by reason of insanity, and the jury was caught in a difficult position. They believed him. They believed he was insane, but they didn't believe he should escape punishment. He might have been mentally ill, but he was still responsible. On the 21st of March, 1935, Albert Fish was found guilty of all 3 murders. He was sentenced to death by electric chair. When the day finally came, he didn't fight it. He welcomed it. Some say he even saw his execution as a form of divine punishment. After his death, Albert Fish's attorney was approached by the press. They knew that Fish had written a final statement, a last message to the world. The press asked the attorney to read it aloud, but he refused. It was, he said, the most filthy string of obscenities I've ever read, and he vowed that he would never show it to anyone.